Hey there everyone. Today we're going to continue our Being in Time for Beginners series. This time we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of the First Division, which is going to focus on being in and being in the world. Just to recap the reading schedule, we are currently on week 3. And this is meant to be such that you can either follow along live as these lectures are coming out and join us for a Zoom where we will actually cover the reading in more detail. And you can see the description for the video where I have the Zoom link and all of the details and whatnot. But even if you're watching this after it came out, you can still follow along with this reading schedule and go week by week with the amount of readings that I have laid out such that it's manageable, and you can follow along with these lectures as supplementary material in addition to the supplementary material that I've mentioned in the first lecture of this series. And I'm pulling pretty heavily from Hubert Dreyfus's Being in the World, which covers the first division of Being in Time, but he goes a lot into Husserl and intentionality, theories of mind and stuff like that, which aren't covered in Being in Time very explicitly, but which is important background information. So I'll be deviating a bit from Heidegger's text here, but we will always be remaining thoroughly grounded in what is being touched on in the text. Now, when discussing being in the world, Heidegger expounds upon the being of Dasein by countering the mode of being which is presupposed by the subject-object dualist. That is, a detached, rational subject which exists primarily as an inner phenomenon and is knowing the world through mental representations. Instead, Heidegger wants to focus on Dasein as being in the world, in der Welt sein. And being in the world, Heidegger calls this a unified phenomenon. And that might sound a bit obscure at first, but this simply means that it defines Dasein's being not as something that is formally separate from the world. Instead, it's integrated with the world, and it's integrated in the world in a streamlined existential state. You know, think of the way you normally exist in the world. Most people don't spend the majority of their lives as philosophers, even philosophers. When we're in our study, sure, we'll go down these, thinking about the difference between mind and body, if there's even such a thing, and Heidegger is kind of doing away with that. But we'll go down these ontological rabbit holes. But most of the time, we don't orient ourselves towards the world as something separate from it. Instead, we exist such that, for example, when you walk into a classroom, you simply open a door and walk in, and you don't even think about opening a door because you've done it so many times. As long as the door is working, it doesn't present any kind of problems for you. So our being is a series of states and actions and ways of orientation which are not primarily formal. And the word formal here has a very particular definition, which, if you're not steeped in philosophy lingo, might sound like we're talking about like formal attire, like nice dress, for example. We're not meaning formally in that sense. When we speak of formal, we're speaking of, for example, a formal proposition in logic, where you have A entails B, and B entails C, therefore A entails C. That's a hypothetical syllogism, right? And in that case, we have a formal relationship between terms which are understood as propositions. So they have a very definite and concrete identity which has been explicated through an analytic, through a deep analysis. Now, Heidegger is doing an existential analytic. So he's trying to look at how does Dasein exist, in what manner does it exist, where does it exist, how does it exist, and whatnot. But in order to do that, he's not just going to be able to list a series of propositions, because as I showed in the last lecture at the very end, there's an ordering principle which is already presupposed in every act of ordering. So, for example, if I have a series of plastic balls of different colors and I coagulate them together and I count them, I can count them and I can look at them, I can figure out their weight and all this, but I can't figure out what delimits them as a being. I can't figure out why is it that this ball is different from the one next to it. Why is it that they each have an independent existence? That is the ordering principle that Heidegger speaks of. This is what Sein is, what being is. It is that which, as we said in the first lecture, determines beings as beings. But for Heidegger, in his analysis, he tries to show that being in the world, one of the primary concepts for understanding Dasein's way of being, is not primarily formal. It's not primarily logical. And in this way, Heidegger is trying to go against a kind of continual current in continental philosophy that wants to reduce things to logic. Instead, he's focusing more on hermeneutics, which is to say interpretation, and understanding things primarily as streamlined and integrated and not as formally definite. Now, when we talk about being in the world, it is important that we understand what Heidegger actually means by world. Heidegger begins by differentiating between the ontic world, and if world is ever in quotation marks, this is typically what's being referred to. Heidegger will sometimes not follow this convention, but it's generally the case that if world is in quotation marks, it is the ontic world. And then we also have the ontological world of Dasein. And just to recap, and again, if you haven't seen the other lectures, please watch the other ones, or this one won't make a lot of sense. Ontic is concerning beings, Seiendes, whereas ontological concerns being, Sein. So the ontic world, building upon this differentiation between categorical and existential ways of understanding, an ontic world is categorical. It is the spatial totality or environment, considered as the sum total of beings. So this would be like the universe, right? It is a bunch of material entities, beings, which just exist as this cumulative whole. He says, with this term, the kind of being of a being is named which is in something else, as water is in the glass, the dress is in the closet. By this in, we mean the relationship of being that two beings extended in space have to each other with regard to their location in that space. Water and glass, dress and closet are both in space at a location in the same way. So this is the ontic world. It is a spatial totality, and beings within this ontic world can be understood spatially as existing on a concrete material spatial plane and have ontic relations to one another. But this is not the case for the ontological world, which is an existential. The ontological world, and this is what Heidegger is trying to explicate, so this definition may sound very obtuse, but it is an ontological structure. This is what he means when he speaks of existential spatiality, meaning it's different from the spatiality of the ontic world, acting as an ordering principle for beings. Right? It allows us to make sense of beings by locating them within an equipmental context or a milieu, which is not solely or even primarily physical. And this has a profound impact on the future of philosophy. This is one of the key aspects that inspired, for example, Foucault's idea of a discourse. So you have, for example, a legal discourse, which is not just a sum of material parts, but it also consists of a number of norms, which are these ordering principles, such that within a given discourse, you have a number of rules and regulations defining how entities within that discourse relate to one another. In the same way, this is what Heidegger means when he talks about a world. We can think of this as an equipmental context in the sense of, for example, Heidegger loves to talk about hammers. And when you use a hammer, you presuppose a proper way of usage, which is a question of, being brought up in this is how you're supposed to use a hammer, this is where you're supposed to use it, this is how you know it's the right weight or whatever. And not only do you have those norms, but you also have the equipmental context of nails, right? You have to have nails to use a hammer. You also have to have some kind of surface that the nails are driven into. And all of this together acts as a context or a milieu within which it makes sense to talk about hammers, specifically a hammer as a tool that we use. And Heidegger's term for tool is Zeug. And he's going to talk about that more in the next chapter, so I don't want to get too much into it, but it is important that we just understand that for something like a tool, it exists in the mode of Vorhandenheit, presence at hand. And I'll discuss this in the future, but for now, it is only necessary to show that when we talk about something which has the mode of being of Vorhandenheit, of presence at hand, it requires such an ontological world, a milieu that contextualizes its being and makes sense of it. A good example of a world that applies more directly to Dasein and not just to Zeug, to tools that we use, is the business world. Right? The business world is a series of trends, of behaviors, of methods of address, of, yes, physical objects, things like currency and pens and suits, but it's also a series of non-physical things which all work together and intermesh together to give us a world which is not ontic, but ontological. Now, one of Heidegger's key concerns is, where is Dasein? This is a question that anyone may ask when they're talking about any entity. Where is it? If we're going to talk about it, that presupposes that we can talk about it as existing somewhere, or at least in some way where we can direct our thoughts towards it. So naturally, where is Dasein is an important question to think about. It obviously exists among other beings, and it itself exists as a being. It's not just this kind of, super abstract, high in the sky mode of being. It is also a very concrete physical body, but its being and its way of relating to other beings is determined by a world which is not solely or even primarily ontic. Since, as Heidegger has explained, for beings to be in the first place presupposes a principle of order, this is being, Sein, which determines those beings as beings. So to understand myself as a being, I must already be understood as being stuck in, so to speak, and without the pejorative sense of the word, a world. I am interspersed within a world. And to better articulate what this world is that Dasein finds itself in, Heidegger states, Ich bin, I am, means I dwell, I stay near, ... The world as something familiar in such and such a way. Being as the infinitive of I am, that is, understood as an existential, so this is not ontic, but ontological, means to dwell near, ... So these ... would be any object or any practice, any norm. To be familiar with, ... This is critical. Being in is thus the formal existential expression of the being of Dasein, which has the essential constitution of being in the world. So for me to say, Ich bin ... I am ... requires that my understanding of bin, of am, is already contextualized by an entire world of practices, behaviors, norms, beings, all of which together act as the ground upon which I am able to talk about my being in the first place. This may be one of the more confusing points, but Heidegger wants to stress Dasein's unity with the world. Heidegger clarifies that this world is not independent of Dasein. This would be mere materialism. Nor is it reducible to Dasein. That would be idealism. So, for example, to say that the world is independent of Dasein is to say that you have two different things ontologically. You have Dasein, which takes up 50% of our ontology, and then the entire rest of the world, which is 50% of our ontology. And of course, with this 50-50 split, you can see that this is naturally going to lead to a lot of theories of knowledge, of epistemologies, which are anthropocentric. And this is also going to turn the entire rest of the world into mere material, which is abstracted away from us, such that we fail to understand our intermeshed nature with the material that we interact with. But also, if we say that the entire world is reducible to Dasein, that the world is basically an abstraction, and, the world objectively is an abstraction, and that it exists primarily for Dasein or as Dasein, that's just idealism. That's to say that the world is primarily a creation of Dasein. And you can see that, once again, either way we cut the cake here, if we try to go for either of these two sides, we get an anthropocentric view of ontology. Heidegger writes, as an existential, being together with the world never means anything like the being objectively present together of things that occur. There is no such thing as the being next to each other of a being called Dasein with another being called world. So what he's trying to delimit here is that the world is not one formal entity over here, and then you have Dasein over here. This is part of Heidegger's conception of ontology, which he takes from Duns Scotus, as univocal, meaning that being, sein, and beings, seiendes, are intimately related and furthermore are equiprimordial with one another, meaning that neither one precedes the other. And equiprimordial is a term of Heidegger's which I particularly love, and I don't see it as often as I should, but you can pick it apart quite quickly, even as an English speaker who knows very, very little Latin at all. Primordial, meaning that it's primal, it comes first, it is more basic. And then equal. These are equally primordial with each other. For being to precede beings, this would mean that our ordering principle exists before any of our beings. This would be to treat being as a being, meaning sein as a seiendes, and thereby a cause of all other beings. This is the ontotheological blunder. This is like thinking of being as God, right? And it just comes before everything else and then causes everything else. But this doesn't actually explain anything, for as Heidegger has said, this just leads to an infinite regress of we either have some uncaused cause, which is essentially now an abstraction that doesn't help us make sense of the world, or we get this situation where for beings to precede being would mean that beings existed before there was a principle of order determining them as beings as such. So you need the ordering principle, being, in order for beings to be understood at all. But you also need something there to be delimited as a being. So neither one of these can come before the other. And thus, Dasein is intimately related to the world as an ontological requirement. They cannot be separated in this 50-50 split like we've talked about. It is an ontological requirement by this analysis that mere materialism is false, but so is idealism. And we're going to get more into the deconstruction of idealism as we go on. Now, one may be tempted when reading Heidegger thus far to think that Heidegger is trying to privilege this understanding of Dasein as being in the world over the material fact of our existence, like he's not giving enough credence to the fact that we are in fact material bodies that undergo material suffering and things like this. So he does clarify that Dasein can be understood both ontically and ontologically. That is to say, both categorically as a present-at-hand object and existentially as a self-interrogating being, Dasein, in the mode of being in. And of course, the thing which we are being in is the world. And the world is something that in the next chapter, he's going to have to explicate more when he talks about the worldliness of the world. So each chapter, we're kind of going more and more meta. So it can be hard to follow along sometimes. And I'm leaving out a lot in this lecture, but I wanted to cover the stuff that is of most importance and oftentimes the most confusing. So Heidegger does not deny that Dasein can be understood ontically. That is, as a merely material thing that's occurrent in the world. Heidegger is well aware that I am in fact a material body, and he's not trying to make light of that. But he does maintain that such a conception of Dasein as reducible to something present at hand is possible only on the basis of Dasein as existing in the mode of being in, and that being furthermore being in the world, and thereafter denying it or abstracting away from it. This is the case with, for example, scientific research, such that in anthropology, for example, we reduce humans to merely material entities, to population densities, right, for the purposes of broad and comprehensive analyses of data and trends. And this can be useful. Heidegger is not trying to deny this, and he actually, in the previous chapter, when he was talking about how our understanding of Dasein cannot be reduced to anthropology, biology, or psychology, he says that he's not denying the validity or importance of these fields for understanding different parts of the world ontically. But if we want to be philosophers and get to the very core of the Seinsfrage, of what is the question of being, we have to be able to go beyond those which are merely going to tabulate together a series of beings. And when we do this to human being and to human beings, we're not entirely wrong, but we're only understanding human being, which is to say Dasein, as not Dasein at all, as a merely present-at-hand thing, which is to say it's some sort of object which becomes a tool for our analysis. And I said that we were going to circle back to Vorhandenheit, to presence at hand. This is the mode of being characteristic of tools, in which a being is usable, assimilable, or present, which is to say reveals itself as something of concern for a Dasein. And when we speak of tools, think of tools in the broadest way possible. Anything which is usable in any way, which reveals itself as something we can make part of our concernful dealings. Concernful dealings is Heidegger's way of understanding the way or the manner in which we most often exist in the world. So present at hand things could be something like a hammer, which is very understood as a tool, but it can also be a book, or it can be a phone, or it can be music. These things which are not typically thought of as tools, but they're not mere materials, but it's also not just Dasein, it is its own thing. Facticity is one of the concepts that I still find particularly challenging and which many readers will struggle to understand. Facticity is Dasein's being as defined by being in, which is to say, it is not mere presence at hand. So we're inching closer and closer to understanding where and in what way Dasein is, in a way that doesn't just reduce us to materialism or to the abstractions such as the spiritual world as an answer to what this existential world is. Because, right, you might be thinking, well, if this is not an ontic world of material beings, then what is it? Where is it? Heidegger states, the factuality of the fact of Dasein as the way in which every Dasein actually is, we call its facticity. Moreover, he states, the concept of facticity implies that an inner-worldly being, it's important that he puts that in quotation marks, because he doesn't actually want us to see a difference between inner and outer, has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up in its destiny with the being of those beings which it encounters within the world. And this latter quote is basically just saying that, look, our sense of self is existentially bound up with the destiny, the dealings, the state of other beings. Dasein cannot be fully or meaningfully understood ontologically if it's defined primarily as a subject who exists primarily on the inside and separate from its world within which it effectuates its concernful dealings. Right? So you don't exist separate from your world. That's Heidegger's key point here. And along with facticity is going to come Geworfenheit, thrownness. This is part of Dasein's facticity, is that it is thrown into a world which it tarries with without necessarily giving its consent or asking to have been here. And this is a world which is equiprimordially beings and being, that ordering principle which helps us to understand beings as beings. Now, in conjunction with Heidegger's preparatory analysis of Dasein in the previous chapter and in the previous lecture, Heidegger is now equipped to add another aspect of Dasein's being, which is care. And this is a concept that's easy to misunderstand, but also not that difficult to misunderstand if you just look at it closely. He writes, the expression taking care is used in this inquiry as an ontological term, an existential, to designate the being of a possible being in the world. We do not choose this term because Dasein is initially economical and practical to a large extent, but because Dasein itself is to be made visible as care, Sorge. So to understand Dasein ontologically, it's crucial to recognize that the world matters to Dasein existentially. That what happens in the world makes a difference to it. It amounts to a subject of concern for Dasein and its dealings. This is what is meant by care. He does not mean for us to care for something or someone emotionally or sentimentally. This would be the psychologist's misreading of Heidegger. Dasein can only care for something emotionally on the basis of the existential condition of care as concern for beings, the fact that other beings are an issue for us or to us. So the fact that just when I'm walking out in nature, for example, and I hear a rustle in the leaves, that automatically becomes of concern for me when it sticks out. And I am always, therefore, tacitly related to the world in the mode of being, which is care. That it makes a difference when things change. It amounts to a subject of concern for me. And it's not primarily emotional. I mean, it's much deeper than emotions. When I hear that rustle in the leaves, and suddenly that part of the world becomes accessible to me, or in Heidegger's language, reveals itself to me, opens up to me, it does so in a way which cannot be reduced to just an emotional relation to the world, because it's much more primordial than emotions. To understand Dasein ontologically, it's crucial to recognize that the world matters to Dasein existentially. That what happens in the world makes a difference to us or amounts to a subject of concern. Now we need to talk about one of the more complex points, which is that of how we get to know the world. So this has to do with epistemology, right? Our theories of knowledge. And primarily, he is going against Husserlian intentionality, which I will explain what that is. One of Heidegger's continual projects is, as we've seen, that he's countering the subject-object dualists' understanding of humans as rational subjects who know their world formally by relating to representations in the mind, which, it should be pointed out, is conceived of as a world of its own, which is epistemically separate from the world of objects perceived and thereafter cognized. So for this understanding of the mind, this would be someone like Descartes. We understand the world formally by relating to representations of the world in the mind. And this inner and outer split begins the problem of how do I know the world, right? This gets us into a whole history of hundreds of years of being stuck in this problem, which Heidegger is trying to dispel with, because he sees that the subject-object dualist understanding of how we know the world is built upon abstractions, upon a formal conception of knowledge, which is in fact not the primary way we come to know things. Heidegger is especially suspicious of the way such a conception of ontology claims that we come to know the world. Edmund Husserl, Heidegger's teacher and a prominent phenomenologist, he really formalized the concept of the phenomenological method, of being able to bracket the world and just look at a series of intentional mental states, which is to say representations. Husserl called this way of knowing intentionality. For such a conception, we know our world by intentionally knowing our world by orienting ourselves towards mental representations of objects outside the mind, which we understand by making them inside the mind, by looking at the mental content of our mind and seeing it primarily as a formal, intentional construction. Thus, for Husserlian intentionality, knowledge is formal, and it can be reduced to knowing a set of facts or propositions about mental representations. And these representations can be thought of as maps, or a copy of the world that's inside the mind. This is famously the case, for example, in Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic, where inside the cave we have a sort of phantasm copy of the universe, which is in fact just images and not reality in itself, and we're trying to get outside the cave. This inside-outside divide is part of the problem which Heidegger is trying to overturn. And Heidegger disagrees with this understanding of how we know the world as a series of intentional mental states. Since considering that we dwell in our world and we exist primarily and for the most part as bound up with our world, right, in this streamlined state of concernful dealings, our way of knowing the world is actually not primarily formal. Instead, our knowledge of the world is implicitly present through our ability to orient ourselves toward and interact with the world. And that implicitly present understanding of the world is the implicit understanding of being that Heidegger says we always already have. That's how we're able to understand beings, to make sense of them as a unique being of its own, is because we have this tacit understanding of ontology, of being, which we presuppose by acting in the world. So being able to tarry with other things, being able to tarry with the world and make it a field of concernful dealings, this is a way of knowing the world. But that may sound strange because we're so used to talking about epistemology as a series of facts and propositions of mental representations. We're so used to talking about it as formal and in this logical way that we don't understand that there is a specific kind of knowledge which most of us have most of the time whenever we're just engaging in the world. Like when you walk into a room and as a way to do that, you open up a door and you go in. You put your hand on the door handle, you turn the handle, you push the door inwards, it opens. You're able to do it with enough force such that it opens, but not with too much such that you break the handle. All of these things are ways of knowing the world which are not known primarily formally. If someone asks you, for example, an alien comes and asks you, how do you know how to open a door? You just say, well, I don't know, I did it enough times. And the alien would ask, well, were you taught how to do it? No, I don't think I was ever taught how to open a door. I don't know if anyone else was, but it was just something that you saw, you learned through trial and error. And that's the key. You did in fact learn it. Because what do we learn in education? We learn knowledge and facts and truth. In the same way, when you tarry with the world and you learn how to get along in the world, that is a form of knowledge. Heidegger, in a state of dismay, says, however, no sooner was the phenomenon of knowing the world understood than it was interpreted in an external, formal way. The evidence for this is the interpretation of knowledge still prevalent today as a relation between subject and object, which contains about as much truth as it does vacuity. But subject and object are not the same as Dasein and world. So that's important. The relationship between Dasein and its world is not one of a subject oriented towards an object, because we are concernfully absorbed in the world. We are not abstracted or separate from it, and we cannot, as Husserl claims, just bracket it and pretend like that is just an inconsequential matter. He continues, the more unequivocally one maintains that knowing is initially and really inside, and indeed has by no means the kind of being of physical and psychic beings, the more one believes that one is proceeding without presupposition in the question of the essence of knowledge, and of the clarification of the relation between subject and object. For only then can the problem arise of how this knowing subject comes out of its inner sphere into one that is other and external, of how knowing can have an object at all, and of how the object itself is to be thought, so that eventually the subject knows it without having to venture a leap into another sphere. Right? This is what this picture is giving us. It's the subject-object dualist understanding of the subject contemplating a world of objects as an inner phenomenon. And when we understand the world in this way, which this is going to burgeon into idealism, this way of understanding the world is a presupposition, as he says. Only by maintaining that knowledge is initially and really inside do we get all these problems of knowledge. But when we understand that knowledge is primarily a question of being in, right? Of being in the world and having to learn how to open a door properly or how to use a hammer properly. All of this is most often not an inner question at all. In fact, it requires coming out of myself, getting my hands dirty, and having to learn how to get along with the world in a way that is not a representation at all. It is a state of fumbling through the world and not fumbling through my inner mental sphere. It's tarrying alongside with and within the world in a way where I am both my own entity, but also irremovable from the world. And this is to say that Dasein and world are equiprimordial. Thus we get to perhaps Heidegger's principal contribution to philosophy, which is overturning idealism. And this is the true power of this work. With it, he's overturning a history of abstractions and artificial problems concerning knowledge and humans' relation to the world. He says, if we now ask what shows itself in the phenomenal findings of knowing, we must remember that knowing itself is grounded beforehand in already being alongside the world, which essentially constitutes the being of Dasein. Initially, this already being alongside is not solely a rigid staring at something merely objectively present. Being in the world, as taking care of things, is taken in by the world which it takes care of. So, right, there is this pull of the world, like a cyclone that pulls us inwards in a pool of water. It is something which we are already within and being effectuated by. And it's as if we come out of the womb already thrown into the world and have to deal with it. And this only works because the world is primarily not a mental representation, but is something which is a milieu, an equipmental context which we are already within. Furthermore, he says, in directing itself towards ... and in grasping something, Dasein does not first go outside of this inner sphere in which it is initially encapsulated, but rather, in its primary kind of being, it is always already outside, together with some being encountered in the world already discovered. Right? We are already amongst the world. In directing ourselves towards something, in making it an object of concern, an object of care, something which makes a difference to us, we are already always outside of the mind, engaged with the world. And this is the primary mode of being of Dasein, is in der Welt sein, being in the world. It is not an inside-outside question, but as I said, it is a univocal phenomenon. That's it for this lecture. I hope that it's been interesting and helped with this particularly dense chapter compared to the ones that we've done such far. Check out any of my other lectures that I do on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.